Welcome, everyone. Thank you all so much for being here today. I know people are thinking this is marathon, a New York City Marathon Day, but for us here at the New York Botanical Garden, it is a bittersweet day because we're saying goodbye to our installation, The Bond of Live Things Everywhere, that you just enjoyed coming down our Mitsubishi Wetland Trail. It is curated by Dr. Joshua Bennett. I'll give a little introductions and then we'll head into today's programming. So my name is Helena Laporte Burns. I'm the manager of public programming and exhibitions here at the New York Botanical Garden. And on behalf of the institution, I want to welcome you all here today. This installation, The Bond of Live Things Everywhere, is presented in partnership with the Poetry Society of America. Curated by Dr. Bennett, it stages Black poetry and performance in the open air, in close proximity to the water and the trees, as well as the live things that evade such proper names. Today, we'll begin our celebration with a conversation between Joshua and Arvelyn Hill. We will then have our youth poets who submitted and won for the Youth Poetry Contest come and read, followed by a gathering DJ'd by our favorite Bronx-based collective, Uptown Vinyl Supreme. So Joshua Bennett is a professor of English and creative writing at Dartmouth College. He is the author of The Sobbing School, which was a National Poetry Series winner and a finalist for an NAACP Image Award, as well as being Property Once Myself, Blackness and the End of Man, Ode, and his latest work, The Study of Human Life, which has been submitted for consideration of a Grammy for Best Spoken Word Poetry Album. Bennett holds a PhD in English from Princeton University and an MA in Theater and Performance Studies from the University of Warwick, where he was a Marshall Scholar. In 2021, he received a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Whiting Award in Poetry and Nonfiction. He has also received fellowships from the National Endowment of the Arts, MIT, the Ford Foundation, and the Society of Fellows at Harvard University. And I'd like to add a friend of the New York Botanical Garden now to that list. And today, he will be joined in conversation by Arvelyn Hill. Arvelyn is the manager of our Everett Children's Adventure Garden at the New York Botanical Garden, where she creates nature-centered science exploration activities for kids. She is also a community herbalist and outdoor educator with a never-ending curiosity about plants and the natural world. Raised on Shingatok land of rural Kent, Connecticut, her love of herbalism grew after the passing of several family members due to preventable environmental illness. She studied at Twin Star, Connecticut School of Herbalism and Energetic Studies, and in 2016 opened Gold Feather, an online apothecary and pressed flower art shop. Arvelyn is passionate about reclaiming herbalism for BIPOC communities and using herbs to build ancestral connection. Arvelyn can be found enjoying growing herbs at her local community garden in Harlem, New York, or sharing herbal tips on Instagram at Gold Feather. And without further ado, I will leave the floor to them. Thank you all.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for this closing reception. Once again, my name is Arvelyn Hill, and thank you, Joshua, so much for being here. We're so excited to just spend the next hour talking a little bit more about this exhibit and also the poems that are in it, and just kind of having a free flow conversation. And there'll also be a chance for you all to ask questions as well, too. So we're gonna dive right in, and I'm gonna read some of the poems that I read in the exhibit that resonated with me. I have the pleasure of working literally right behind you. You probably walked there to get here at the Everett Children's Adventure Garden. And we have had the exhibit in our space for the past 7 weeks. And so it's been cool to, as someone who works here, seeing this pathway known as the Mitsubishi Wetland Trail being transformed by these collections of poems. It's so special. So I'm so honored that you are here and curated this experience. It really has been hugely impactful. So yeah, the first poem that I'm gonna read is called Generations by Lucille Clifton. Generations. People who are going to be, in a few years, bottoms of trees, bear responsibility of something besides people. If it was only you and me sharing the consequences, it would be different. It would be just. generations of men. But this business of war, these war kinds of things, are erasing those natural, obedient generations who ignored pride, stood on no hind legs, begged no water, stole no bread, did their own things, and the generations of rice. I'll let that marinate for a sec. So I'm gonna read one more poem and I think we'll talk about those too. So this next one is called After the Whiner by Claude McKay. Someday, when trees have shed their leaves, and against the morning white, the shivering birds beneath the eaves have sheltered for the night, we'll turn our faces southward, love, toward the summer isle, where bamboos spire and shifted grove and the wide-mouthed orchards smile. And we will seek the quiet hill where the towers the cotton tree and leaps the laughing crystal rill and works the droning bee. And we will build a college there beside an open glade with black-ribbed bluebells blowing near and the ferns never fade.
Oh, yeah. Thank you.
So I chose these poems for a lot of different reasons, but I also want to know why you chose these specific poems in this exhibit.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, first, and I know you just got done clapping, can we have a quick round of applause for Helena, for the entire Botanical Garden staff, for the Poetry Society of America, and for everyone gathered here. It's such an honor to share this space. I was born in the Bronx, in the BX borough, many years ago, and it's always a pleasure when I get to come back. Yeah, these poems have been on my heart for a long time. I'm a self-taught poet. I did not grow up reading poetry on the page or really understanding its mechanics. But when I got to graduate school, I was already a spoken word poet. I'd been on tour around the world. And one of the best things about being at Princeton, probably my favorite thing, was the library card. It meant that I got to sit in Firestone Library day after day and study the poetry section. So that's what I did. That's how I taught myself sonnets and pantoums and puzzles, how I taught myself the music of poetry on a page. And Claude McKay and Lucille Clifton, these were some of the first poets that came to me. I know too, Arvin, that we have an Upper Valley connection, so I'm a professor at Dartmouth. And what many people don't know about Claude McKay is in addition to being a Harlem Renaissance genius, he was also a janitor in a frat house at Dartmouth when he was much younger. He also worked at the Hanover Inn in Hanover, New Hampshire. And that's where he wrote Spring in New Hampshire, that famous poetry collection. And so when I was putting together the poems for this installation, I thought about maybe poets who we knew well, but we didn't know them as nature poets. Maybe poets whose names you've heard, and others who I imagine a number of us haven't heard, right? People like Angelina Wells Grimke, right? Who I only discovered a couple of years ago, who was a librarian and a Black queer woman who was writing constantly about her relationship to the trees and the plants, and once described the trees as brown girls, right? In one of her poems, and that just stuck with me, and I thought, what would it mean to share the kind of revelations I had in that library with the public? I thought the best way to do it was with music. So thank you to Marcus Johnson for his, auditory genius and pairing the soundscape with it. And then the last thing I'll say was I knew there had to be music. Stevie Wonder is my dad's favorite musician. So I thought, okay, let's go to Stevie and listen to what he has to say about nature poetry. And he has this gorgeous album called Journey Through the Secret Life of Plants that came out in the early 70s. So we took pieces of that. We took Black gospel songs, Roll Jordan Roll, poems about having a right to the tree of life. We put it together and we were able to build this. So it's a long-winded answer. The rest would be much more concise. But I wanted to give some background before we got started.
Thank you. Yeah, that poem by Lucille Clifton, as someone who also, when I was younger, kind of learning about Black poets, my mom gave me a Lucille Clifton book, and it was one of the early introductions. But revisiting again in the context of this exhibit also was just reminding me so much of the responsibility we bear as a society to what the future looks like in terms of climate change impacts and the ways that intersect Black people, specifically people of color, Indigenous people, and the ways where it's not just a personal issue, it's together, all of us, in terms of even the way she says, people who are going to be in a few years bottoms of trees, like literally going back into the earth and what we are going to leave behind. And right now we're living in, could be a very scary time. Like we're finally, I think as a society getting to a point where it's like, okay, like we really need to do better, but also it's more than just, because I feel like when I was a kid, it was like, save the whales. And so it's kind of like moving away from just the animals, but also the people, the places. And as Helena shared in my bio, like I feel really powerful about that because I did see so many elders in my family, unfortunately, lost to environmental pollution in their neighborhood. My mom was the youngest of 10 and all of her siblings are gone. So for the span of 10 years, I lost all of my elders. And so it really does feel like a shift in terms of like, we do this work more than just, you know, plants are beautiful to grow, but also it's like a reclaiming, I guess, too.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more then, because you brought up Clifton, and then for those of you who don't know, Lucille Clifton, Mount Rushmore American poet, mother of 6 kids, Jeopardy champion. I always have to throw that in there, you know. But she wrote children's literature. She was always very attentive to the life worlds of children. And in doing some research for this event, I mean, I watched her YouTube videos. They're fantastic. Please check them out. Arvela's YouTube videos are great. And with Plants as Liberation, you're always giving directions for children to encounter the natural world, right? Take an adult with you, gently lift the log, right? And then look under it for signs of life. And I mean, can you just talk about why you geared not just that content towards children, but I think your larger practice? Where did that begin for you?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I will, as you all know, I work here. And during 2020, we were all in a very wild situation where we weren't able to come to the garden. Not even people who worked here were able to be here. The only people who were able to be here were horticulture, because we got to keep the plants alive, and security, because the place needs to still be safe. So as a staff member, I wasn't able to be here for many, many months. And it was really, we're a very place-based institution. All of the work that we do with kids is in the garden, touching plants, investigating decomposers. So I found myself still working, but at home, back at my parents' house in Connecticut. And honestly, my mom was like, what are you gonna do? Like, you gotta figure something out, because what's gonna happen? And so it literally was like, you know what, let's start making videos. So she got her iPhone, I got some food scraps that were in my kitchen, and we're like, we'll do a quick video on a regrow garden. And so I had some scallions that I was regrowing. I had an avocado seed that I had sprouted. And we literally did the video in like one take. And my boss was like, send it over to the marketing team, see what they're gonna do with it. And they were like, this is amazing. Like, let's start releasing these. So it became kind of just out of like a way to figure out how to still make my work relevant when I can't physically be with children learning about plants. And it kind of evolved from that. So it started with the regrow garden video, and then it evolved to also videos about looking for decomposers, really getting kids to go, not feel like the only way they can access nature is at the New York Botanical Garden, but that nature is all around them. And so it could be as simple as going outside of your neighborhood, studying trees on your block. It could be growing literally food scraps in your house on your windowsill, if that's all you have, because a lot of times that's what all people had when we were stuck inside. And so it kind of evolved from there, and now it's become Plants as Liberation too, which is a time where I've been sitting down with different Black people in the plant world and asking them questions about their relationship with plants. So I've spoken with people like Leah Penniman, who is of Soul Fire Farm, an amazing racial justice activist and farmer, to house plants enthusiasts, Mariah, who literally goes by the plant doctor, and will come to your New York City apartment and basically give you houseplants and show you how to grow them. And so it's kind of evolved from a series like that. And even though luckily we are back in the garden, we are able to have kids again, we've still found that it's valuable, because we really don't want the only notion of your only access to nature can only be here. It can be everywhere.
That's stunning. It's funny, I got the chance to talk to Camille Dungy, who, if you don't all know her, another incredible poet, essayist. And I told her it wasn't until my son was born, my son August Galileo just turned 2 weeks ago. It wasn't until he was born that I became a nature poet, right? And part of how that happened was that I went on walks with him every day, and I started trying to teach him the names of plants and animals. And among other things, that meant I had to look them up. right? I had to learn about gladiolas and magnolias, right? And jungle rice and the various even kind of weeds in the neighborhood. So can you talk a little bit about the surprises in your work with children? What has it opened in your imagination that maybe wasn't open before? What unexpected directions has it taken you in to do this incredible work only several feet away? I feel like the rain is applauding for us. That's just how I feel that.
I love the garden in the rain, and we're all protected underneath the clay picnic pavilion. Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up about your son, Galileo, right? August Galileo. Because 2 years old is actually the youngest age group that I work with. We have a program called Nature Explorers, where literally it's 2 to 3 year olds come to the garden with their caregiver, so you would come, or a grandparent, and we go on a hike together, and we talk about the weather with puppets, we sing songs, we do little crafts. And I love that age group so much because for a lot of these kids, especially the ones in the past couple of years, they were born during 2020, so it's their first outing, their first time not being with just their parents, leaving the house, kind of going and being with other kids, being in nature, and just seeing the ways in which they open up, because it's 6 weeks for 1 hour. And they're just uninhibited, they just dive right into wanting to use a hand lens or go on a hike. Some people think, oh, a 2-year-old's not gonna go on that long of a hike. I've hiked through this forest behind us with a 2-year-old in the winter time. And they walked the whole time, didn't need their stroller. So it's amazing to see that, and we see kids grow up here. So they might start off as that nature explorer, and then they'll come back and they'll do camp. They'll come back again and they'll be an explainer, which is the teen program in the children's garden, to then even being an employee of the garden. So really raising plants and kids here and youth in the Bronx, and Bronx kids as well. So I think I love that age because it really is so pivotal. And there's different horticulturists here who work here who say, yeah, how I got into plants was I went on a walk with my mom and dad when I was a kid, and that kind of was my first introduction. So it does not go unnoticed that those moments aren't just little, they're huge.
Okay, first of all, I feel like you need to send that to the marketing team.
Oh.
Raising plants and kids
Yeah.
is so great. And it just sounds like it's so central to the vision of what you all outlined here. So can you talk a little bit then, I guess, about your relationship to poetry, if there was any before? I mean, I'm always curious about how people, and even jealous. One of my graduate students, I was getting his PhD in English. He writes about Black nature poetry, but it was during the pandemic. And he said, Professor Bennett, I think I'm gonna go study agriculture in Mississippi because I write about this stuff, but I need to start getting my hands dirty. And I just thought, man, that's so beautiful. But in the back of my mind, I was like, why didn't I think of that first? I think that's right. There's something about getting your hands dirty, going in the hike, during the winter, that just has a different kind of texture to it. So can you talk about your journey, I guess, back to the creative writing, or what role writing and poems in particular play in the work you do?
Yeah, I mean, I went to a school where we had this thing called declamations. I don't know if anyone ever had that in their school. So every spring, everybody had to memorize a poem. And when you were in kindergarten or first grade, you got to memorize the poem with your class, and you would recite it together. But as you got older, they were like, okay, you're not doing it with other people. You have to do this by yourself. And so all spring, every day, different kids throughout the whole school all have to recite a poem by heart. And I got super into it. Became a declamation champion. I would memorize these poems, and if you were really good at it, you got to do it at graduation. You could also get a declamation prize. But I always did poems that were Maya Angelou, Why the Caged Bird Sings. It was intense stuff, and I feel in a all white school in Connecticut, they were not ready for it. They were okay, this is a lot. So it was I would get far, but the kids who would always win were the ones who would have a funnier poem or something that made people laugh, where I was let's talk about racism. Let's just talk about it. Literally. But it did activate a love of poetry. So in college, I took a lot of poetry classes, and I wanted to be a writer for a long time, and I thought that was going to be my career. But plants caught me. But yeah, I definitely used to be deep into poetry in college. I also loved Caribbean literature, and I felt most of the literature that I was reading that was about nature and the environment were by Caribbean literature writers specifically. So it's kind of molded in that way. Now at the Children's Garden, we also highlight different children's books. We display them along our path so kids can read the books as they walk through the garden. And that's kind of my new relationship with children's literature.
That's amazing. I feel like this is the background for so many of us. Like I went to, you live in Harlem, yeah? So I went to a school in Harlem called the Modern School, which was founded by a woman named Mildred Johnson, whose uncle, James Weldon Johnson, wrote the Black National Anthem with her father, John Rosamond Johnson. It's a lot of names at once. But it was an incredible experience in part because we had to memorize poetry and we would perform plays. And it was the most normal thing in the world to me until I got to public school and realized that when other people said the national anthem, they didn't mean the Black national anthem. So I'd never heard the Star Spangled Banner until I was 6 or 7 years old. And I just thought, this doesn't even really slap the same. You know, like the Johnson song, it's a poem, you know, and it was 300 Black children, you know, singing it in an auditorium each morning. And that's so interesting. You felt the plants calling to you. Reminds me of George Washington Carver, you know, when he would say that the wilderness was God's radio and that the peanuts spoke to him. Y'all know Carver, the inventor of peanut butter, peanut shampoo, peanut soap, hundreds of uses.
A genius.
Yeah, he was brilliant. And right now I'm actually writing about this entomologist named Charles Henry Turner, who was up for the same job as George Washington Carver at Tuskegee. Carver got the job, so Turner became a high school teacher in Ohio and ended up publishing more than any other entomologist in the field during his time with experiments that he paid for with his pocket money. So I'm in a very professorial mode right now just because I didn't get the chance to teach in person for 2 years. So I'm very excited to even have people here.
Well, what kind of sparked when did you realize you were going to be a poet, and when did poetry kind of catch you? Did you have poets in your family? Like, how did that origin story?
That's a great question. So I grew up around Black Baptist and Pentecostal ministers, mostly women, and the way people responded to their sermons just grabbed me, you know? So, I mean, depending on the kind of like Black church you grew up in or been around, you've seen it. People doing cartwheels, crying, falling out. You know, my mother, she would hear a good sermon and say, that's my word for the week, as if it was almost a kind of armor she carried with her. So I was always around that. My big sister used to have Maya Angelou, and Maya Angelou is slept on. I just want to say this, because recently one of my good friends, my son's godfather, he's a historian, he sent me this like 45-minute live set that Maya Angelou did on YouTube. And what I think doesn't come across in the written poems is how funny she was and the kind of command she had over a stage. And this was a packed stadium of people there to hear her poems. And her banter was just elite. So I just wanted to point that out. And, oh wow, that's amazing. It's actually my sister coming up the path right now, which is incredible. Hey, Toya, we love you. But she had Maya Angelou's Phenomenal Woman taped to the front of her bedroom door. So I always tell my students, you know, I walked past poetry every day on the way here. And I don't think I knew I'd be a poet professionally until it already had started to pay dividends. So when I was 20 years old, I got invited to speak at the White House and to perform poetry for Barack Obama and Michelle Obama and some other folks that had gathered. And before that point, my mom said, you want to be a professional poet? That's a terrible idea. It's a total waste of money. She'd already paid for private school and for most of college. But then she got to meet Michelle Obama and she chilled out and pushed her Secret Service out of the way and the whole thing. And I think at that point I realized I might have something. Like if I can keep traveling, if I can keep writing things that resonate with people. And especially, again, I love that we talked about YouTube earlier, because it was just this democratizing force, right? Like I didn't have a publisher yet, but I had these YouTube videos people were watching. And then eventually, you know, my sister and I, we started this company called The Strivers Row. We started working with a group of Black poets from around the country, and we started touring the world together for the next 5 or 6 years. So that's really how I became a professional poet, just getting together with my college friends with whom I'd done, you know, poetry slams and open mics and said, look, what if we made this a job, you know? And now we all do different things. You know, Zora was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in drama a year ago, which is incredible. Carvings was George Washington and Hamilton on Broadway. And I'm an English professor who gets to wear, you know, green suits and talk about flowers. So that's a lot of fun. And I'm really happy that poetry panned out for all of us that way.
That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, I think that's so inspiring because I feel like a lot of times people are like, oh, you want to be a poet? You're going to have to actually be a journalist and maybe do the poetry on the side. Or you're going to have to do this, but then it might be your thing. But you found a way to make it your full thing. And I know we have some young poets in the audience.
Yeah.
And so I'd love to know, like, do you have any advice for young people who love poetry or getting into it but not have the support to make it a career yet?
Yeah, poetry doesn't have to be your day job, is actually what I would say. Almost all of my favorite poets actually had day jobs. Isn't that like Audre Lorde was a librarian for people, which is a beautiful job and a necessary job that's currently under attack in our country. we'll put that to the side for a second. I think as long as you're engaging in whatever electrifies your mind, right, that's what I would suggest to young poets. Keep it just as a daily practice of surprising yourself with language, right? Something else Audre Lorde said, she loved poetry because it was short enough to write in between shifts, right? So a poem, it doesn't have to be hundreds of pages long. Get a couple of lines down a day, right? When people ask me about my writing practice, I say, yeah, I write every day, but I don't write an epic every day, right? I jot down a couple of lines, I have a notes app open on my phone, and I'm just trying to, pull from the atmosphere and sort of jot down the miracles that I see every single day. Inspiration doesn't have to bowl you over. Sometimes it's just a little bit of light peeking through the glass. And so the advice I would give, always write poetry. Always have it as something you either keep close to you or share with others. And I was getting a PhD at the same time I was writing my book. So I don't want to act like, I was out here for poetry full stop. Like my mom made sure. She was like, look, brother, make sure you have some kind of thing that's paying the bills and keeping the lights on. Even though getting an English PhD wasn't the best route, if that was the advice, but I figured it was as practical as I was gonna get. My mother knows her son. And so, that was my commitment, is I knew I wanted to be a teacher. I knew poetry was always gonna matter to me. And I knew that poetry, is the last thing I'll say on this, could feed my other pursuits. Even now, I don't know that I feel like poetry is what I was put on earth for. I feel like it's a vehicle. One of my favorite TV shows ever is *Halt and Catch Fire*. And there's this beautiful line where they talk about computers. They say computer is not the thing; it's the thing that gets you to the thing, right? And I think that about poetry. To me, poetry is a vehicle to get to change, to opportunities for young people to speak their minds. Man, I love that poetry helped create this occasion for us all to gather here. That's the magic of the thing. I love, a beautiful metaphor, a beautiful image system. But for me, it's an excuse for people to get together on a Sunday and think about some cool stuff, and talk to each other. That's how I'm always teaching poems, as a social occasion, and as an opportunity for us to renew our habits of assembly.
So beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, I feel like poetry also is so hard, to get just a little bit amount of words to send such a strong message is such a craft. And I wonder, what is your editing process like? Are you sitting with poems for years? Are you going, just popping them out? How do you get to the point where it's, ready to be released?
Sure. There are poems that have taken me a decade, and there are poems I've written in 15 minutes, and that's what I tell the students, too. I also edit on the road, so in part because I have a spoken word background, the poems you see in the book often are the final version because I read it in about 5 to 10 different venues, and I saw, okay, this is funny, this line lands, this ending doesn't work. And having that be a social process has been so beautiful. So I always edit in community because I write in community. I don't know I have a collection until I've done kind of a 5 for 5 or a 10 for 10 exercise with my friends. And for those of you who don't know what that is, that means for 5 days in a row, you exchange poems with someone you know, or for 10 days or for 30 days. And every day you have to send a poem back and forth. That's how I've finished every single book I've ever written. I'll call my friend Daniela or I'll call my friend Tim. And it's like, all right, you want to do a 15 for 15? I'm trying to get this into the publisher. And that's just, I feel like that's liberated me, to be honest. I think I once had dreams of being the lone genius. And I think I got this in grad school too. I don't want to blame Princeton for too much. But I think I had this idea that I needed to be the lone genius in the library for 12 hours and the magnum opus would come pouring from me, in one fell swoop. That eventually just seemed less cool, kind of every day when I would go to try it. I was like, man, this sucks. I want to go back to Washington Heights and go eat some wings and hang out with my friends. And I found when I did that, the poem started flowing, right? Because it was coming from, again, the din of the ordinary. What I was hearing my friends say, what I was seeing on television, what I was learning from family, right? In their grief and celebration, I realized this is the kind of writer maybe I've always been. I've always just been trying to bear witness to what I see and just elevate the language of this already incredible set of forms all around me. One more quick thing. Should we do a Q&A, maybe? If anyone has questions at any point, hey, I see we're synced up, don't worry. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to just put a finger. Ooh, does someone have questions in the back? Oh, that's my dad. Hey, Dad.
Hi, this is so great. It's so great to be here today. That Claude McKay poem, I noticed that there was some imagery that's similar to Yeats's Lake Isle of Innisfree, and I wondered if Yeats maybe borrowed from Claude McKay. I mean, it's just interesting that the cottage and the glade and the bees. I just was curious to know if there was any other, if he was doing, if there
Yeah, that's a great question. What's the best thing I can say? Hey, Pops. Yeah, the best response I can give to that is actually that the person who was reading it here in the installation is a Yale English professor named Ernie Mitchell, who was my roommate a couple of years ago. And he's writing a biography on Claude McKay for Yale University Press. That'll be out next year. I would email him, so I'll give him your email after. But I wouldn't be surprised, if there was some kind of correspondence there or some history we can unearth. But yeah, reach out to Ernie because he knows everything Claude McKay. And he helped put me on too to that piece about Dartmouth, which was so interesting. We had a great conversation about that, these sort of submerged histories of the books and the poems we love. Who would have thought that he was engaged in this kind of dispute with the Hanover Inn where they were worried that having a Black man working at the hotel would be upsetting to his fellow laborers, And we have these letters from McKay just sort of making his case. And I wouldn't be surprised if there are letters speaking to that Yeats connection as well. Anyone else? And then we can pivot right back, because I know you got questions.
I do.
So.
Well, I would love if you could just share more about the inspiration behind this exhibit and kind of why the title, why the poets, the whole message that you're trying to convey.
That's a great question. Well, the title, Helen, let me know if we're tight on time too. Okay, we got a whole system worked out. All right, so the title comes from a Lucille Clifton poem called Cutting Greens, okay? Where she talks about feeling the bond of live things everywhere. She's cutting up, some collards and kale in her kitchen. And that just stuck with me, because it's not the bond of living things everywhere, right? Which is different. And if you read the poem Cutting Greens, she uses Blackness as this gathering space, right? It's not just racial Blackness, because she says the cutting board is Black, right? The greens are Black. And then she says the kitchen twists dark on its spine. So all of a sudden, Blackness is everywhere. And it's not a marker in any meaningful way of division. It's actually a space where many forms of life, right? Human and more than human forms of life come together. And that stuck with me. And I thought, okay, what would it look like to use Clifton's line as a jumping off point to think about all of the live things here? So the tables that come from the trees, and the pavilion that comes from the trees, and the trees itself, and the dirt, and the people who come from the dirt, right? Humos, that's dirt. That's where we get human from, right? To be human is to come from dust and to return to it, right? And so I thought about that, and I wanted to use Clifton as a jumping off point. And then for the individual poems, I wanted to do a couple of different things. So if you look at most sort of eco-poetics anthologies, and even my personal favorite, 2009's Black Nature by Camille Dungy, you'll see a fair amount of those poems, but not all of them, right? So I wanted to think, what are some poems that even in the Black sort of nature poetry canon have not necessarily been considered, in part because they're just very recent. So one of Terence Hayes' American Sonnets, for instance, is in there, right? And the American Sonnet is an invention by a poet named Wanda Coleman, right? Who's a teacher of Hayes. And so I wanted to keep that reflection there. Araceli Skirme, her poem Elegy is there. Because I wanted to think too, Black nature poems, they're a space for all sorts of reflection, right? It's the celebration of the beauty all around us, but also a space of grief, right? A space to think about racial violence. And so I wanted to put together a constellation of poems that celebrated all of those different facets of this tradition I love. And then again, just to bring up kind of minor poets like Grimke, who I think many people haven't even heard of. And, she's one of the last poems we see, and I thought that would be great. And then finally, even for poems that are canonical outside of that Black nature poetry subset, like Hayden's Frederick Douglass, I thought, what would it mean to read this as a nature poem? Because I think it is, right? It hasn't often been written about that way. But that's part of the larger project, right? Is to say, as you said earlier, the natural world is not just in the botanical garden, right? It's not just in an arboretum. It's all around us. Nature's not out there. It's within us, and it's all around us all the time.
Oh, that's amazing. Yes. And I know that you also said that it's inspired by a free Black community that's written about in Beloved too, right? Yeah. Can you talk more about that too?
You're really on it today, man. I'm killing it. That's deep research. Yes. So it was inspired, and I actually have to tip my hat to the Poetry Society of America for this, because our early conversations, we talked about Beloved, Toni Morrison's incredible novel, maybe the finest American novel ever written. And this moment where they're all in the woods, the space in the woods called the clearing, right? Capital C. So there's the sense too that it's larger than life. And Baby Suggs, one of my favorite characters, right? Gives this beautiful sermon in the clearing about loving your flesh, loving your heart, for this is the prize, right? Yonder they do not love your flesh, yonder they flay it. And I thought about what would it mean to gesture towards that fictional space that's based on real historical materials like the book itself, right? And to say, what does it mean for us also to kind of break down the walls between genre too, right? So I'm pulling from history, pulling from fiction, pulling from poetry, pulling from preaching and music and saying, this is all Black aesthetics, this is all Black expressive tradition. And I just think that message is so powerful, and it's a universal one, right? That over and against what the world may say about you, how it may make you feel about your body, your skin, your mind, there's another more powerful story that we're creating together, and that story can be the truth, right? So I wanted to center Morrison's capacious vision. Another one who I think is a nature writer, right? If you look at, Tar Baby, if you look at Song of Solomon, right? Which is the first novel I ever held in my hands. My sister had a black hardcover copy with red pages, so I thought it was the Bible, right? When I was like 4 years old and said Song of Solomon on, I was like, oh, wow, that's so cool. And so it was the first, besides the Bible, big book I ever held in my hands. And so I felt like if I did something like this in public, Morrison had to be at the core.
And it also reminds me so much of Octavia Butler too, like Parable of the Sower, and thinking about like, what does it mean to reclaim land, reclaim our community as well? Like, I've been thinking a lot about Seneca Village, which was a Black community where Central Park now is. And during this, at the time, the 1800s, Seneca Village, they had 2 schools, there was graveyards, there was 200 homes, and just the displacement of that to put Central Park, which we know there now. So all the ways in which history, Black people have been displaced from land and taken away from land. We see that, unfortunately, again, right now with gentrification all over New York City, in the ways in which people are constantly being displaced from where they're from. But also I see a pivot, definitely during the pandemic, of people wanting to return to the land, returning to gardening, growing, urban gardening, herbalism in all ends, and also knowing like it was always within us.
Yeah.
But we were told like, oh, you can't have that anymore, or taken away. So I just think it's so beautiful that this whole exhibit is kind of a big ode to that as well.
Thank you so much. Yeah, just thinking about 2020, even these pictures of protests in Texas. I don't know if you've seen these images of Black people protesting on horses. And that image has just stuck with me for so long, in part because my family has Southern roots in North Carolina and Alabama. And I was raised with these stories of my father, who was also one of 10, right? Eating Red River clay, right? And I think at the time, it was a story to teach us to be grateful for our food, right? Like it was like, boy, you better stop playing. Like I grew up tough. But I think it was also about intimacy with the earth and telling me that there are other ways of knowing that belong to us, Joshua, right? The horses, the trees, the birds. This is a deep knowledge that you should never be ashamed of. And so much of my intellectual project is also, I think, trying to recover Black people's relationships with animals. If you look at the first 10 African Americans to earn PhDs in the United States, more than half of them were in the sciences, which I feel like people don't know, right? First Black man to earn a PhD in the US, PhD in physics, right? Charles Henry Turner was another one of those folks, but also Ernest Everett Just, a Dartmouth alum. Arvelin's dad went to Dartmouth, shout out, right? Hanover is all up in this conversation. It's fascinating. It's on video, so shout out, right? But he was a cell biologist, right? And there are these early stories of him, one being a nature poet, which I thought was incredible. Him and Turner were both poets, but they were scientists because they went outside, because they were in the soil, because they were observing the water. And I've just been thinking a lot. And they also had a social justice vision, right? So part of what I've been trying to reclaim for my students, none of whom are English majors, right? Almost all of them are in econ, right? They're poli-sci, they're in sciences. So they come to poetry, one, for an escape. But I've been trying to tell them, like, look, if you look at a Black history of science, many of these folks are scientists because they believe science was one way to refute an anti-Black vision of the world, right? They were saying the racial violence that's projected upon you intellectually is non-scientific, right? So even before we can get to a moral argument, we could just say scientifically, the arguments you made about Black people's brains, about their bone, is false, right? But we've lost that, I think. The idea of a kind of social justice, racial justice vision of the study of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And the idea that that could start with the nature poem, I think, is so beautiful, right? The people who were the shining stars in that tradition, they knew that poetry wasn't valueless, right? If anything, it was their beginning, and it brought them along a path that I think we can all admire today.
I love thinking about all of these science majors in your poetry class, like as their escape of like, ooh, okay.
Yeah, they can't believe it's school. Which at first I was kind of offended. I was like, what do you mean you can't believe it's school? But increasingly I was like, oh wait, you don't get to do anything that's not graded, right? So I have all my students free write poetry. Anyone who has ever taken a college class with me has written at least 10 poems, right? Because at the beginning of class, everyone sits for 7 to 8 minutes and they write a poem based on a prompt I give them. And they're always surprised that it's not graded. They're like, well, what do I do with it? I say, whatever you want. They can't believe that, right? Because so much of their life, everything is graded, it's evaluated, it has to be handed in as a measure of proficiency, and that they've gathered the proper instruments from their professor. And I'm saying this is an opportunity for reflection. You've been running around all week, going to your 4 classes or whatever. Sit here and think about a ceiling fan, right? Or write a poem about a place you loved with birds in it. That was the prompt we started with this term, you know? And they're some of the best young writers I've ever seen. My computer science and econ majors, my D1 athletes who came to Dartmouth to be runners and basketball players. And that was their primary relationships. They're narrating, this is from them, right? Saying to their bodies. And now they're thinking about what it means to not be a basketball player anymore, not be a runner anymore, not be a quarterback anymore. And they're processing that in the poems with their colleagues, right? With 11 of their fellow students who they don't know at first, right? They have to learn each other's names. That takes 5 to 6 weeks, right? Just for people to learn names. But I find out now they're reading each other's poems after the time. I mean, getting kind of worked up about it because it's the kind of thing you don't think is possible when you're alone in the library reading this stuff, right? Is that you'll get to meet these students who pay way too much money. And I tell them that, I'm like, man, this costs too much money. So I gotta make this worth more than what you would get if you just had the library card, right? And that's the best pitch I can make, is that the poems are time for you to sit and concentrate on your human soul and what you've seen and survived and loved. We can bear witness to it, and we can create a record of it here. And we can listen to some dope music. You know, I'm so glad we started with the DJs, you know, because you don't have a party without the DJ, right? And I tell my students, my leadership model is the DJ, right? It's not just the person who gets up, gets to be James Brown for 45 minutes a week. That's what I thought being a professor was. And then I realized, no, it's about setting a tone, creating an atmosphere where learning can take place. That's what being a leader is. That's what being an educator is. You know, I don't know how I got here from your question. I was very moved by it. Because teaching has really brought me to that space, you know, of radical gratitude. Because you get up there every day and you have to trust that these people will hold you, right? Hold you accountable, but also keep you safe. And so poetry's always done that for me, you know. It's been a place where I could rest, but also a place where I could grow in kindness, but also in strength.
Yes.
How are we on time? Brett? Oh.
I would say, anyone in the audience has questions? It was a good time.
Hi, it's been amazing so far. Can you talk a little bit about some poems where you talk about escapism and kind of the love and Blackness and being able to rest somewhere? Can you tell us some poems that provide that for you?
Emily, you want to start?
I mean, I'm going to let you speak to the poem part of it.
Sure.
But I have been reading Rest as Resistance, which is, if you've not heard of the NAP ministry, Patricia Hersey. She's basically a advocate, a minister of rest. And her big message is allowing people to reclaim their relationship with rest because of the ways in which capitalism, racism, oppression has told Black people specifically that we don't have time to rest. We must constantly be working to the point where our bodies are dying. And so she literally very simply tells people to take a nap. And she hosts these gatherings where she makes comfortable spaces for people to sleep and to rest and not feel guilty about it. And I just got her book and I've been reading it. And so I think that's been really transformational for me as someone who is a very busy Virgo. I'm always on the go, doing the most. Just reminding yourself to just sit down, and that's okay. You don't have to always be filling moments with things. So that's for me.
Wow. What a beautiful recommendation. I second that. I took a nap 2 days ago. I was a different man when I woke up. I said, oh my goodness. Woke up at 2 p.m., I was recharged. In terms of escape, That's such a good question. Let me think. Tracy K. Smith's Life on Mars. That book, I'm teaching it this week, so it's fresh on my mind. But I've been thinking a lot about her poetry, and her father helped build the Hubble telescope. And so there's a lot of writing about his relationship to science and other, scientists around him. What else? Oh, Sonny Patterson. We know this place. She, I don't even know if I would say she's Mount Rushmore spoken word poet. She's by herself, Sister Sonny out of New Orleans. I'll say We Know This Place is a great kind of transportive poem. Almost anything by Saul Williams. He's got this poem, Amethyst. Okay, you notice. You know about Saul. Okay, so you're already well acquainted. Anything by Gwendolyn Brooks, her collection, Blacks, which is published by Third World Press. I mean, I sit so often with her sonnets, especially this poem called The Preacher Ruminates Behind the Sermon. It's a gorgeous poem that's just transports me every single time. In part because it's this image of a preacher thinking about like, who are God's friends, who pats him on the back, offers him a Coca-Cola. I mean, it's just like a beautiful kind of space of rumination sort of poem. So, but I got a bunch, so I could talk to you after too, and I'll give you the full playlist, with some good stuff. Anyone else? All right.
Anyone else? I can pass the mic. Okay. Then I'll just come on up here really briefly. Can I please have a round of applause for